Hey everyone, Nick here. So in this video, we're going to be covering forms in Flutter, specifically how to implement text fields, switch controls, checkbox controls, how to validate your form fields, and also how to save them. Also, how do you organize your code so that you can work with the form data easily? So let's get started. So if you want to follow along in this tutorial step by step, you can also follow this blog post that you see in front of you, which is on the website. If you just go to blog and just find this article, and it'll give you all the code examples that I'm using. Also on GitHub, I have the code for the post, so there's a link to it here. So let's get started with creating our first screens. So I already generated a Flutter project, and so I'm going to go over with you the basics that you need and what we're going to be creating. We're going to have main.dart, and that's going to run an app. An app is a stateless widget that I created. It's very simple. It holds all our screens in our app. So let me open that, and I'll increase the text size here. So app, again, is a stateless widget, and it's just going to return a material app widget. You should already know what this widget is. And the home screen will be called, we'll load this screen that we're going to create called home material. So later we're going to create home Cupertino, which is the iOS style version of a form. So that's why we have home material, and here home Cupertino I have commented out for later. So just to get started, implement this stateless widget, and now let's just step by step work in creating the form itself. So create a file first in a directory called screens. That's where we're gonna keep every screen of ours, called home_material.dart. Home material is just going to be a stateful widget. So to review here, I have the boilerplate code for a stateful widget. First off, we have our class called home material, and we're going to override the create state method, and it's going to return an instance of our state. So this is our home material state, and there's a main build function here that we override. This is where our form is going to live. So let's continue on. So when we work with form data, when we update form fields and all of that, just to work with data more easily, I usually use models. And a model is a logical way to represent a grouping of data. So create a models directory. I already created one on the left here. And I'm going to say new file, and I'm going to call this user.dart. Because our screen is updating a user profile, we're going to represent it with a user model. So I'm going to paste in user right here because it's just easier. And basically, let me paste in the core fields to this. I'll just paste in everything. And I'll just go over this. So the user, these are the fields of the user, right? A user has a first name, a last name, they're both strings, and a list of passions. So this is going to correlate with the checkboxes we have in the form. And I'm referring to each string value as the code of the passion that I check off, right? And right now I have this defined at the top. They're static constants, strings, so that I can change this easily without having to, I can refer to the same code easily throughout my app, and it's defining one place rather than duplicated later. We're going to be referring to these values in the form itself, so it's important to define the strings here up front. And also if the user is subscribed to the newsletter. So it's just a fake field, but it's a Boolean field showing you how to work with a switch control. So this is going to correlate to a switch control in our app. And finally, we have a mock save method. It's just going to print some data out. In another tutorial, we can wire up to like a web API, like a HTTP API. But right now, it's going to be pretty contrived regarding this. So going back to homematerial.dart, because we have a stateful widget, we're going to create an instance of our user. So we're going to just say user and instantiate it, and it's going to live in our state, and it's going to have an underscore because it's private. That we don't want anything else accessing it. So that's why there's an underscore, and then we're going to import user at the top, models user.dart. Cool. So next, let's implement the container for our form. So because we're going to render just a basic screen, I'm going to render a scaffold. A scaffold has an app bar, which is the navigation bar you see at the top, and a body. So the body is going to have a container, and it's going to have some padding, and the child. So the child is going to be basically a builder, and we're not going to cover that in this tutorial, but this function here is going to contain all the implementation logic of our screen. So our basic screen is going to be a form, and the form is going to have two critical fields. It's going to have key and child. So key is a common parameter for any kind of widget in Flutter, which lets the widget be uniquely identified in the widget tree, the render tree. So if you don't know a lot about that, it's not very important right now. But to kind of get a unique key here, we're going to use a special class in Flutter called global key. So global key, you'll see it used in the official Flutter examples. All it does is you can get a unique identifier for your widget. And in our case, it's going to be of form state type. So you have to specify a type for your global key. So we're going to say form key. It's going to be a member of our stateful widget here. And then we're just going to say global key of type form state. And then that's it. So let me put this here, alphabetical order. And then we're going to continue. So the key is going to be form key. It's really simple. That's all you need to use. So later we're going to be referring to form key to get access to our form when we save the form, but that doesn't make sense right now because I haven't shown you the code. So we'll just continue. So now we have a child. So the child of our form is the main container for all our form fields. And because the form fields will be laid out in column order, we're going to just specify a column. So that's a layout type in Flutter where any items of the column are going to be laid out from top to bottom. So in our column, I'm going to specify a kind of just the layout. So I want every row in our column to be stretched. So from left to right. So from the edge of the screen to the other edge of the screen. So say cross-axis alignment stretch. And then we have the child. And here we go, children rather. So each child of our column is going to be a different component in our form. Some of them will be like containers, some will be just straight up form fields. So let's cover the first form field that we're going to implement. So the first form field will be a text form field. This is like the most basic form field that you can ever implement. And there's a few parameters you can define for it, but you can actually just define it alone. I can just have 3 of them and that's it. So let's see if this works. Let's end our parentheses here. And then let's see if this saves. Cool, it saves. Let's see if this worked. Open our app. Cool. So this is the screens that this is the like super simple screen. There's 3 text form fields. I can kind of switch between them when I tap on them, and that's it. So that's a basic form. There's no save button there yet, but we'll get to that. So next is the checkbox control. So I'm going to have a container here. And the container is going to be just a section header. So I'm going to just say subscribe because I want to, this switch control I'm going to create has a kind of, it's just a section of the form. So let's save that and using hot reload and show that just some text appears here. Next, we're going to cover switch list tile. So the switch is a Flutter field that's just a simple switch, but a switch list tile gives us a row where a text label can be on the left and the switch will be on the right. So it's kind of a convenience widget so that we can show that label and switch together. So let me just paste this in. So let me just paste this in. So we have the switch list tile. I'll just type it out. And it has a title and a value. Those are the two main fields. So I'm going to say monthly newsletter, and the value is going to be the user newsletter field. So this is going, because this is a stateful widget, if the value of this changes, it's going to update that switch to be either selected or deselected. And that's it. So let's save this and see where it gets us. Let's see here. Is it starting? It crashed somehow. It stopped working. Let me start it again. And let's see what other things I have to do here. So next we're going to implement the onChanged value for this switch list tile, just to show you how updating the switch will update the state of our widget. Let me just show it to you rendered, starting up here. Cool, awesome. So we have this subscribe container with the text field, and then this monthly newsletter. And you can't select it because we haven't implemented the special event called onChanged. So let's implement that now. So onChanged is an event whenever that gets triggered whenever you change the switch. So you're going to have it pass in the value of what has been changed. And what we're going to do is we're going to set our state. So we're going to say set state because it's a stateful widget. And we're going to set it to the value of what was selected. So newsletter equals, and then value. Let's see here, and this here. What else do we need to do? That's really it. Value. What am I missing here? Set state. Actually, well, we don't need this here. There. Okay. So now it's enabled, and whenever I change my switch, it's going to update our user instance of our stateful widget. So that's pretty cool. You can't see it in action right now, but you'll just know that it's just working. Cool. So next we're going to implement a number of checkbox controls. And this is the last kind of widget we'll implement. And then we'll fill out the implementation of the validation of them for each widget next. So we'll go back to the text form fields and customize those. So we have this another widget called a checkbox, but we're going to use a special one called a checkbox list tile. So we had switch list tile, but now we're going to have a checkbox list tile here. So let's see, comma checkbox list tile, and checkbox list tile has a title like the same thing like the switch had. And let me just paste this in. Title like this, cooking. And then we're going to have a value. So the value is going to be the user passions, and then user.passion cooking. Cool. So let me just break this down for us. So user passions, remember here we have passions. So I'm referring to my user instance as passions, but I'm referring to the value. So the value right now is false. So the key of the map is passion cooking. So I specify user.passion cooking. I say user dot because this is a static variable. And then it gives it the value. So the value right now is false. And if that state changes, the checkbox will get checked. So the state will affect if the actual checkbox is checked. So let's save that, see if it worked. Cool. So this is disabled. This checkbox is disabled because there's no handler implemented. So let me implement that now. So it works the same way as the switch. So I have onChanged value, and then I can do whatever I want. I'm going to say set state, and then I'm going to set it to user passion cooking, and then whatever that new value is. So let me update this. I hate, oh, this tooltips are kind of annoying. I have to disable them. Let's see here. Okay, cool. So now it's enabled and I can update it. Cool. Great. So let's continue. So I'm going to paste in the rest of these checkboxes because just easier that way. And it's kind of redundant. So we have passion traveling, hiking, etc. So cool. Let me restart this. Great, restarted. So let's see here. So we have each one of these checkboxes. When it's selected or deselected, it's going to update our state, same as the switch control. Let's give it a header. So I'm going to add in a container here with a text field. And that container is just going to say interests. So now I have this interests header here. So now let's implement the rest of our form fields in that we need validation. So validation, basic validation is important to implement, but you don't want to go crazy with validation. You typically want to have it handled by the server. So if this is getting submitted to a server, that server is going to decide if it's valid or not, or if even the values are required or not. That way you can deploy updates to the server a lot more easily than resubmitting the actual app. So every form field in Flutter, especially the material design widgets, not the Cupertino widgets because iOS works differently, has a validator property. Well, almost everyone. So let me paste that in for you and then explain that. So I want to paste in some decoration here to my first form field. And I'm gonna give it some something called an input decoration. Input decoration lets me specify a label for my form field. So if I don't have a value in there, it's going to show the word, like the word's first name. And then if I have a value in there, it's going to just go up here. Next is the actual validator. So the validator is this validator parameter, and then there's a value, and then I have my logic here. And if it's invalid, it's going to return a string. So now I can say if the value I have in the text field is empty, I'm going to return, please enter your first name. Cool. And then that's it. Now this has to be triggered by a special method. We're going to do that next. We're going to implement the button that saves it, and then we can call the validator. So this will execute when that happens. So let's now implement the rest of our text fields here. So I'm just going to add in this validator and this decoration for the second form field. And that should be it. I'm going to remove this form field. Let's see if it renders okay. Cool. Looks like it's all right. First name and last name. So cool. We have our validators in there, and I'll show it to you in action when we implement the save button. So the last major thing we have to do now is implement a save button. So let's go through here. So the save button is pretty simple. I'm going to have a container at the bottom, and it's going to be of type. It's going to have a widget called a raised button widget. So this is a material design widget. You can see it here, raised button, and the raised button is something where I can define an onPressed event. So that's the only value we're going to give it, onPressed. So let me close this and then close the container, and then that's it. So raised button is not going to have a title here yet. So let's implement this now. So implement onPressed here is very simple. So this is the implementation logic for it. And raised button, we'll say we're going to first need to get a reference to our form. Why? Because our form, we need to call special methods on our form. We can't just refer to it easily. And the way we refer, we get a reference to our actual form we're working with, is via our form key member. Remember that we specified a form key up here. So here we can refer to that. So it's just a shortcut way to refer to it. And then we say form key current state. So because it's a form key of type form state, as you can see here, form state, we can like refer to this member here, current state. So that represents the actual form. So now we can say if form validate. So what this is going to do is execute each validation property on each form field. If any of them are invalid, it's not going to execute this block of code. So if it's valid, we're going to say form save. Form save is something we'll cover in a sec, but basically it takes all the save events of your form fields and executes them. But we didn't implement that yet, so I'm not going to add that quite yet. So if form validate, we're just going to do nothing. So let's go like this. So because we have our validate methods hooked up, like for example, the first one, please enter your first name. When we click save, it's going to execute this logic on pressed, right? And then it's going to take the form and it's going to say if form validate, it's going to execute validate. And so it's going to execute the first validation function of this form field. So this value is empty. So that's why it's going to say, please enter your first name. So that's why that turns red. And so the form field takes care of the styling for you. So if there's an error, the values turn red. And then I enter something and then I hit it again, it turns blue again. So it's cool. So that's how validation works on a basic level. So the other form fields like the switch control, the checkbox controls don't have this validate parameter because there's no validation needed. There's no, we're not going to validate that this is checked or not. So that's something that we don't need to implement for this tutorial. So the next thing I want to cover, and this is the final thing, which is how to save the form. And there's certain fields on the form where called onSave, and that's an actual event we can customize, where it runs some code and then it decides it lets us do whatever we want when that form field is saved. So it'll make a lot more sense when we start implementing. So I'm going to implement onSaved, and that's another property. It's going to work a lot like the validate. So it's going to take a callback here with the value that was saved, and then we can do whatever we want. And when the text field is updated, when we call save form.save, we are going to set our state for this form field. So we're going to take whatever value has been updated, and we're going to update our user's first name with the new value here. So let's finish this. Cool. Okay, so let's continue with implementing onSaved for the rest of our form fields. So we have this first text field. I'm going to paste in the next text field, the implementation for that, because it's pretty much the same thing, onSaved. And then, so updates our last name. And then for our switch list tile, we don't have this onSaved event, it's just onChange. So we're already setting the state whenever we change that value. There's no onSaved for that. And then the checkbox list tiles, we already have, again, the same thing. So onChange, it's already setting the state. So the main so that's all implemented here. And the main takeaway here is that every form field, whenever you're working with it, you're updating it, and we're calling save, we're going to make sure that we set our state, because when we submit our form, we want to make sure that the user model here that we're going to submit is up to date. So that's really important. So let's go ahead and finish our code example by implementing the actual saving of the form. So now that we have a valid form, if it validate passes and it executes this code block, we're going to call form.save. And form.save is going to iterate through every form field in the form. And if it has this onSaved parameter, it's going to execute that code. So when I click the raised button, it's going to execute, and it's valid, it's going to execute form.save. And then form.save is going to go up here first, and it's going to make sure that this is executed, updating the state user.firstname, that's our state, with a new value, and then all the rest of the form fields. So now at this point where my cursor is, I know that the form is, all the state of our widget is up to date. And then we're going to call user.save. This is our custom user. I'm going to open the method again, and it's just going to print something. Usually you would write, like, post the data to some web service, but here we just print something. So user.save, and just for the heck of it, I'm going to show a dialog like, hey, this worked. And show dialog is not covered in this tutorial, but it's just going to show like a snack bar control, which is just a little message at the end of the form here. It's just a little tiny bar that appears. So let's see this, and I'm going to make sure I enter some data. I'm going to hit save, submitting form. You see that at the end here. Cool. So the one thing that we didn't add, I forgot, is the label for the actual raised button. So the way we define the label is that the raised button, another member of the, another parameter of that is child. And child, we can give it whatever we want. So I'm going to specify a text field. And now I have this save label here. So that's our example. So the final thing I want to cover is showing you the iOS version of the form. It's very simple though. I only have 2 text fields, but I want to just quickly show you the code on how the code is different, because on iOS there's different features and there's different behaviors of the actual form. So I wanted to quickly go over the Cupertino version of the form, which is very simple. It just has 1 text field. So what I did was I enabled Home Cupertino. It's a separate screen here in app.dart. You don't have to follow along with this. I'm just showing you. And let's look at this. So this is the Cupertino version of the form. This is the Apple version of the form. And it just has some text here. You can implement like a validation method, all that stuff. And then when I hit submit, it shows a dialog. And the main difference is that you have a Cupertino page scaffold, Cupertino nav bar, all that stuff. And instead of like a form text field, it's just Cupertino text field. And then instead of a raise button, you have a Cupertino button. And there's still the same thing where you can just say validate on the form. I didn't implement this, but it works generally the same way. But typically this is not super realistic, because you don't want to implement 2 versions of the form based on what operating system you have. You typically want to have something that's very looking good on iOS and Android, and something that's familiar to both users. So if I'm implementing material design on material design here, let me just re-enable it. I'm not going to want to show this to iOS users, this style, because this is material design style, is not familiar to iOS users. It looks like strange to them because this is completely different UX. You can do this, but it's just not common, right? So what I would do is, and what we'll do in later videos, is actually customize this form to make it more generic looking, and style it in a way that looks good on iOS and on Android. So thanks for watching, and check out the blog post if you have any questions, and you can get involved in the discussion there if you have any specific questions, or you can just email me. So thanks for watching.